Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome back to the Bretton Woods Committee's 2022 annual meeting. We've had an action-packed agenda today. We started this morning with a members-only meeting, and we had a really rich discussion on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, which we will hear more about today. We also just wrapped up a really rich discussion on climate finance. So I encourage everyone to go to our website and check that out. And then tomorrow we are going to convene in person for the first time since before the pandemic. So very much look forward to seeing many of you tomorrow. But this afternoon, we are very honored and delighted to have a very special guest, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing his remarks. So let me quickly introduce our featured guest today. Daleep Singh is the Deputy National Security Advisor for International Economics at the National Security Council, and also Deputy Director of the National Economic Council at the White House. Two very important hats you wear there, Daleep. He previously served in the Treasury Department of the Obama administration and spent some time at the New York Fed, I believe, with our BWC board chair, Bill Dudley. So great pedigree, and very much excited to have a fellow North Carolinian join us today, Daleep. So welcome. We're very pleased to have you. And Meg Lunziger will be moderating today's conversation. And Meg is a public policy fellow at the Wilson Center, but importantly, she is the co-chair of BWC's legislative working group, and she really leads BWC's engagement with the US government, including Treasury, the White House, and US Congress. Meg also serves on our advisory council. So Meg, thank you so much for your leadership. I'm going to pass it over to you to kick off the conversation.
Well, thank you very much, Emily, and let me join you in welcoming Daleep here. It's a real pleasure, and we're looking forward to getting your insights on what's been going on and looking ahead as well. There has been a whole lot of news this last week. I mean, the last couple of months, many developments unfolding even as we're meeting here. Comments of Secretary Yellen, Deputy Secretary Adeyemo, the White House, other departments. Could you just take a couple of minutes to bring us up to date on what the latest is in the developments in terms of the Russian-Ukraine situation and what you think is going to be unfolding in the near future, and then we can dig a little bit deeper into some of the details. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Good to be with you, Meg, and thank you, Emily. I should say that my brief time at the New York Fed was after Bill Dudley's presidency, but we were together once upon a time at a bank that I will not mention. Okay, so on state of play, maybe I'll just take a step back and describe where we are, at least with respect to sanctions, in terms of goals, design, mechanisms, and the effects, and then we can jump into the details if you'd like. So the first point, I should just make is that imposing these costs with sanctions, we've never thought of them as an end to themselves. Their purpose has always been to try to advance a geopolitical objective. And before the invasion on February 24, the real geopolitical objective was deterrence. We were trying to borrow from modern central banking in the use of forward guidance by signaling our capacity and our readiness to impose the most severe sanctions at our disposal, and indicating that we were going to take much more severe steps than we did in 2014. Our goal was to shape his expectations about the cost of the war and to change his calculus under the logic that the best sanctions are those that are never used. Now, of course, that strategy didn't work, and the rest is history. He invaded. And so once that occurred, the purpose of sanctions from our perspective really changed. And our objective now is to maximize the costs on Putin for the continuation of the war, subject to an acceptable amount of spillover costs to the US and the global economy. And importantly, to generate a demonstration effect for any other autocrat that wants to create his own backyard and redraw borders by force. So in terms of mechanisms, I would just say there are 5 channels that I think about in terms of this sanctions regime. Channel 1 is most familiar to people in the committee, I'm sure. It's the immediate and acute harm that we impose through financial sanctions, really a capital account shock. And that's what the financial sanctions on Russia's largest banks and its central bank were designed to accomplish. Channel 2 is more novel. We haven't used it on a large market economy, and that's the denial of cutting edge technology and the sapping of human talent that we think is necessary for Russia to sustain its military and to sustain its productive capacity. Channel 3 is I guess I would say the methodical removal of the benefits and privileges that Russia has enjoyed as a full participant in the international economic order. So we've, with the G7, denied borrowing privileges from the IMF and the World Bank. We've revoked most favored nation trading status, and we've put Russia on the cusp of default. Channel 4 is probably the most controversial one right now, at least. That's the downgrading of Russia's status as a leading energy supplier. And I'm happy to go into all of the trade-offs that are involved on that front. And lastly, the last channel is exposing and holding to account the Russian kleptocracy by seizing their financial assets, also their physical assets. And the goal of doing so is really to demonstrate to the Russian people that they've been getting ripped off by their leadership for a very long time. Why don't I just stop there? I can talk about the impacts that I see in any of the channels themselves if you'd like, Meg, but let me pause.
Yeah, thank you, Daleep. That was a really helpful outline of all the different approaches that we're trying to bring together and persuading Russia to change. What has struck me is how the impact on the Russian economy is really beginning to show. And we've seen these public comments by the central bank governor, others about the real pain that's going to be coming to the Russian people. So my question to you is, how bad do you think the Russian economy is going to be this year as a result of the sanctions, and what how effective that might be in bringing President Putin to the negotiating table and getting him to cease his aggression in Ukraine? Thanks.
Yeah, that's the right question. So I'll start with the aggregate economic effects, and then maybe get into some of the more micro consequences, and then broaden out from sanctions to some of the other levers that we're deploying, and give you a sense of whether I think it's working. So in terms of the aggregate economic effect, I mean, yes, these sanctions are generating the impact that we warned Putin about for months prior to the invasion. I mean, you've seen the estimates. Most private analysts, also the World Bank, are projecting a double-digit contraction in Russian GDP this year. The IMF slightly below double digits. Just to put that in perspective, that's more than twice the contraction that Russia suffered after its default in 1998. But unlike then, when Russia was in the process of getting integrated into the global economy, it's now in the process of getting isolated from the global economy and becoming a pariah state. So this year alone, if that contraction prevails, that will wipe out the past 15 years of economic gains in Russia. Inflation is already above 17%. Most analysts that I see project it will rise. It will continue to rise towards 25% this year. Policy rates have been eased somewhat, but they're at 17%. So the combination of sky high inflation levels and also interest rates, that's going to be a major drag on Russia's growth prospects. And so will the exit of, I think it's now more than 750 private sector companies that are leaving Russia, fully or in part, and so too the impact will be severe in terms of the human talent loss. I've seen estimates that 200,000 plus of Russia's best and brightest have already left since the invasion. Many of them work in the highest productivity sectors, including tech. And I think that's really important. We in the US have long had an asymmetric advantage in terms of attracting technical talent, STEM talent from autocracies going all the way back to the 1930s. And we haven't really used that tool very much in the past couple of decades, but I think it's quite important now to not let that tool lay dormant any longer. In terms of some of the micro effects, I mentioned the export controls, and I think a reasonable estimate is that Russia's imports will contract by more than a third this year. And the purpose of our export controls is quite specific. We want to degrade Russia's military industrial complex. And we have some anecdotal evidence that that's working. I've gotten reports that the Russian military's ability to replenish equipment, for example, precision guided missiles that depend on Western microchips, is already having a real effect in terms of exhausting those supplies. Two of Russia's major tank plants have halted work because they lack foreign components. 70% of Russia's commercial airline fleet, and I think 95% plus of Aeroflot's fleet is already grounded. And I can go on with more anecdotal examples in heavy equipment and chemicals and other key parts of the industrial complex in Russia. But this is, I think these micro level indicators are going to have a more profound effect on Russia's supply chains and its productive capacity over time. They're not as evident as the financial sanctions are on day one in terms of the visibility of the impact. And I think at a really personal level, this is all very sad, of course. It's going to be harder for Russians to travel abroad. Their debit cards may not work. They may only have the option to buy knockoff phones and cars and clothes. And this is what it looks like to descend into isolation. As to whether this has an impact on Putin's calculus, this is the ultimate measure. I mean, I should say sanctions are never, at least I never think of them as a standalone solution. They only work if they're embedded in a broader strategy. And that strategy has to involve a military dimension. And in this case, that's why we're making all efforts to help Ukraine fight for its freedom. We're trying to supply as much equipment along with our allies as we can to make this costly for Putin. This is also, I think, a qualitative difference from efforts to resist Russian aggression in the past. We're also trying to deal Putin a very weak strategic hand by helping Europe diversify away from Russian energy, by encouraging countries like Sweden and Finland to join the NATO alliance, by fortifying NATO's eastern flank, by dealing with the spillovers of this war in the developing world, food in particular, but also energy and migration flows. That's how we create staying power in these sanctions. And I think staying power is what you need to create leverage that ultimately, we think will matter in terms of a negotiation to get to a diplomatic solution down the road.
Thank you. That's really important. And what I'd like to just sort of follow on, I mean, have we communicated to the Russians a sense of how we would de-escalate the sanctions if they were to pack up and leave Ukraine? And I would add, importantly, help with the reconstruction after all the destruction they've wrought on the country. Any sense that they're responsive to that?
I think it's premature, Meg. We have channels of communication that are still open, but we're not at the point at which we're talking about sanctions relief because the escalation of Russia's aggression continues, shows no signs of stopping. And we wouldn't, even if we were at that point, we wouldn't negotiate the relaxation of sanctions above Ukraine's head. This has to be a deal that Ukraine owns. And undoubtedly, part of that negotiation will involve a question of security guarantees, the removal of Russian troops, the question of what's the territory that exists in a sovereign Ukraine post-invasion. All these questions are really important. Sanctions are one element of that negotiation, and we're not going to impose our views on that prematurely.
Thank you. That's really reassuring to hear that it's part of a much bigger picture. I just hope that there's something that'll finally get President Putin to the table and get him to change his behavior. But I wanted to just bring up a couple other, big countries that are very important in this, and this is, say, China and India. China, I mean, it's a little bit of an odd picture there. The government has been very clear about they're not going to join in the sanctions. Yet, many Chinese companies are being very careful not to run afoul of the sanctions the U.S., Western Europe, and other countries have put in place. And you're also recently in India, I know. I was following the press there, talking to them about what's going on with Russia in terms of the actions in Ukraine and India's public stance on it. So could you just bring us up to date a little bit on how you think these two countries might be brought along or what their thinking is?
Sure. And I'll give you two different answers. With China, I mean, I'll say for me, it's easy to get dizzy over the messaging coming out of Beijing during this war. I mean, the domestic Chinese media is basically echoing Russian propaganda and blaming the US for provoking the conflict, for NATO for provoking the conflict. By contrast, China's international diplomats are speaking the language of peace and the UN Charter, emphasizing the importance of territorial integrity and sovereignty. It's Chinese corporates and banks are largely being cautious and steering clear of outright sanctions evasion or backfilling of the export controls. But there's troubling evidence that the PLA is providing support to the Russian military through a number of direct and indirect channels. So on the surface, it can appear quite incoherent. For me, I suppose this is what happens when your strategic interests are in tension. And I think that's the case with China. And I think they have an interest, they share an interest with Russia, first and foremost, in undermining the US and the West in terms of our dominance of the international order. I would also say Beijing perceives an interest in prolonging this conflict between Russia and the West, because it may sap the strength of both sides and give them leverage, particularly over Russia, and make them a junior partner in the process, but also perhaps with the West. On the other hand, I think China has a serious interest in being seen as a responsible global stakeholder on the world stage. It doesn't want to intensify the conflict too much and spiral out of control. And, the spillovers to energy markets and food could become unmanageable for Beijing, particularly in the context of a homegrown supply shock emanating from the zero COVID policy. And then I think the last part of this, which just adds another dimension, is the risk appetite between China and Russia. I mean, China is very much a rising power. It's benefited from the world order as it stands. Russia is, by all measures, really a declining power and is willing to take much more risk to upset the state of affairs. And, I think at some point, this becomes a difficult balancing act for China to pull off because of the misalignment in Putin's risk appetite relative to Beijing's during a year in which they want stability ahead of the party Congress. And so I actually think this quote unquote no limits partnership is very much has limits, and we in the U.S. should treat this as a tactical opportunity to actually find some ways to cooperate with China on areas of mutual interest, on climate, perhaps even on trade. There's some political opportunities for us to settle, the dispute that's been going on now since 2017, at least in part. So that's my view on China. I think with India, it's a different circumstance, and we're going to play the long game here. We just have too many shared interests, too many shared values in common to let India's historical relationship with the Soviet Union and then Russia to get in the way. I mean, the two areas that get mentioned the most, at least in the media, and the media is quite enthusiastic in India, are energy and defense. And on energy, I mean, the reality is India only imports 1% to 2% of its oil from Russia. And so we and others could very easily step up and provide India a different source of energy. And if India decides to continue buying Russian energy at the current quantity, but at a steep price discount, that's not a problem in terms of our strategic interests, because it just means less revenue for Putin to fund his war machine. On defense, this is going to take longer. Roughly 2/3 of India's defense equipment is from the Soviet Union. So despite we've told them that we're ready to step up and to help India diversify its sources of defense equipment, that's a process that will take time just because of the longevity of many of this military equipment takes a long time to replace because it lasts so long and it's quite costly. So we can work that out. But in the meantime, our trade relationship, our investment relationship, India wants to deploy 500 gigawatts of non-fossil fuel energy. We have a strong interest in playing a prominent role in that transformation. India has a real vision to boost its infrastructure financing. We have a vision to boost our provision of support for countries that need infrastructure and climate and digital and health and gender. So there are just so many areas in which this relationship has a natural tendency to get stronger. And we've just got to manage through some of the short-term friction.
Thank you. I was really happy to hear you say that you're looking at avenues for actually cooperating with China and certainly with India too, because I think that's the route to go, is to try and build those relationships, deepen them, and try and bring them around to how important it is to maintain these kinds of relationships with the US, with Europe, with the largest economies in the world. So I think that was very positive. And I say this because I read Secretary Yellen, I listened to Secretary Yellen's speech last week, and it sounded a little, I don't know, she put a word of caution out there to any countries that, if they're undermining the sanctions, that we wouldn't take it lightly. So I'm glad to see that there's this effort to find these avenues of cooperation and areas where we can work together. I think that's very positive. If we could turn to some of the impacts on the other countries in the world. This is Bank Fund Week in the spring, and clearly we're all worried about the effects of, first of all, COVID, the ongoing pandemic. Countries still haven't recovered. We've seen these tremendous supply chain effects, with shutdowns in China, but other problems as well before that. And we also have the impact of the war, and we're seeing that all the, Ukraine, breadbasket to the Middle East, North Africa, parts of Africa in terms of its exports, the also fertilizer coming from Russia from other countries. And so there's going to be this tremendous impact. And we see this effort led, Secretary Yellen has been leading this. We've got the efforts at the fund and the bank on food security. What more can we do? Are we going to be able to have a big increase in our aid budget, for instance, that could help provide, because a lot of these countries are just going to need outright grants to help them meet some of their food needs this year, energy needs. And are we going to be able to do that?
Yeah, great question. And you're right, there are direct impacts of this war, and there are a whole host of indirect impacts. I think you named the two big ones in terms of direct effects of the supply of goods that are produced and exported either by Ukraine or Russia. Energy is obvious across each of the main products. And on food, yes, wheat, maize, sunflower oil, and you mentioned fertilizer and fertilizer inputs. And then on metals, even though metals are not sanctioned, there's a risk premium that's built up in a lot of traded metals on global markets, and palladium, high-grade nickel, vanadium, titanium, and even neon gas, which is a key input to several of our supply chains. Then there are all sorts of indirect effects that we have to think about carefully, effects on confidence, growth psychology, financial conditions, inflation expectations, the second order effects on central banks. So all of those are relevant, but let me just drill down on energy and food, because I think that's where you were most interested in more detailed thoughts. And on energy, this is a major challenge. We're trying to do three things at once. As I mentioned, we want to degrade Russia's status as a leading energy supplier over time. So that's one. But two, we want to maintain steady global energy supplies as the global economy is still trying to recover. And then three, we need to transition to cleaner and more reliable sources of energy. So how do you do all three things at once? And the answer is different for each energy product. On natural gas, we've taken steps in this direction to do all three, to meet all three objectives by first working with Germany to shut down Nord Stream 2. Second, agreeing on a deal between the US and the EU so that we can surge LNG exports to the EU while the Europeans build more of their LNG import capacity and also distribute. While the Europeans build LNG import capacity and the distributional infrastructure to make sure that their imports are actually getting distributed to the places that need it most. And meanwhile, on both sides, we agree that our export capacity for LNG and Europe's import capacity, that infrastructure is powered with clean energy, that we reduce methane leakage in the process, and that the infrastructure can be retrofitted to transport hydrogen, so it's not a stranded asset in 10 years' time. On oil, it's even more complicated. The US, Canada, and the UK, we've all announced oil import bans from Russia. And as everybody knows, the EU is contemplating the same. And look, ship-based deliveries of crude oil from Russia to the EU are already down something on the order of 1.5 million barrels. If you add the production outages in the Caspian pipeline, the best information I have is that Russian oil exports to the G7 as a whole are down about 2 million barrels per day. About half of that disruption is currently being reallocated, to the best of our knowledge, to India, China, and Turkey. And meanwhile, OPEC Plus is only slowly increasing production. And even with increases to their production targets, their actual output is falling well short of the target. And then if you look at the US situation, US shale is much more focused on capital discipline right now than responding to price signals. So you put it all together and we have a big imbalance, and the market's clearing at prices that are much too high for comfort in most consuming countries. So we've tried to lessen that imbalance with our own unprecedented releases from the SPR, and together with contributions from the IEA, that gets us to about 1 million barrels per day of supply over the next 6 months. And that could be a bridge to when we think domestic US production will ramp up with a lag to the price signals that are out there. So it'll ramp up, we think, about 750,000 barrels to 1 million barrels towards the end of the year. Now, this concept of RSPR providing a bridge to US domestic production really doesn't work if there's a further hit of oil supply from Russia to the EU. So if there's an outright oil import ban that takes out the remaining 2 million barrels per day, that's a real imbalance that will be difficult to offset, because the ability for India, China, and Turkey to continue increasing their imports from Russia, it's limited by refinery capacity constraints, as well as shipping and logistical obstacles. So, at most, maybe 25% of a further disruption could get reallocated. And that's what's led to some of the discussions that are taking place in Europe. And President Draghi has been a proponent of price caps. And I know Europe is discussing this. We're doing our own analysis there as well. And then the question is, with a price cap or with a tax or a tariff, can you reduce the amount of revenue that Putin is receiving from export revenues to a considerably greater extent than you would with an outright oil import ban from the EU, while at the same time containing many of the spillovers to inflation and to growth? So we're trying to strike the right trade-off. That's where the conversation is. Just quickly on food, and we can talk more about this if there's additional Q&A. I think there are 4 or 5 things that are worth knowing about our policy response. Number one, you'll hear from the MDBs and the IFIs and the G7 this week very clearly. We want to call on countries not to put on export bans or any kind of restrictions on the provision of food outside of borders. Number 2, if countries have spare production capacity to produce more food, this is the time to use that production capacity. Number 3, for countries that have stockpiles of food, India is an example of one, so is China. This is the time to release those stockpiles to countries that are most in need. Maybe taking a page from COVAX. And then lastly, the IFIs and the MDBs, they really should act now to cushion countries that have acute food insecurity problems and could fall into balance of payments problems as well, as a consequence of the price of food imports rising so fast.
Thank you. That's really helpful, because that's something I've been focusing on. Secretary Yellen convening her meeting, talking about this, the 2 institutions here in Washington, as well as the others, very much focused on this. But all this takes time to deliver to the people who are going to be hungry in the very near future, and the countries that are running out of their own stockpiles. And we're very reliant on the imports. So it'll be, I think, extremely important for us to keep those efforts going, and to increase the speed of being able to provide that assistance. I wanted to come back to something that you mentioned earlier in terms of, the inflationary impact, which we're feeling here in the US as well. But you had talked a little bit about when we were talking about China, just are we actually considering perhaps lowering some of our tariffs on the products from China that were imposed by the previous administration? And this would help on inflation, might help on the supply chain side. I mean, what's the sense of this? Where are US producers in those competing industries? How are they thinking of this or making any comments?
Yeah, so maybe I'll lift up a bit and give you a sense of the US-China relationship at a strategic level, and then drill down to the implications for tariffs. And because I think it's important to link the two. And our diagnosis of President Xi's ambition is that he does want global supremacy, and he wants to achieve supremacy primarily through economic and technological primacy. I think a corollary to that belief is he does believe, and he's said, that the US in particular and democracies in general are undergoing a form of inexorable structural decline. And so this is a time to take some risk. It's not the time to hide your strength and bide your time, as used to be the mantra under Deng. So there's we still see a lot of muscle flexing that's taking place by China strategically, and it also is evident in terms of our economic relations. So we believe we're in full-fledged competition. We've got to be clear-eyed about that. It's not necessarily a terrible outcome from the world, and I alluded to the cooperative elements of the relationship. There's a state of the world in which this becomes a race to the top. More public investment on both sides, more indigenous innovation from both sides, more productivity, more labor force development, more long-term strategic policymaking, especially here in the US. But no doubt it's also going to involve economic frictions. The economic model of China under Xi has become increasingly state-led and centralized. That's not, in our judgment, likely to change over time because the type of market-oriented reforms that are needed imply a loss of control that President Xi appears unwilling or unable to accept. And so his growth strategy is likely to remain underpinned, in my judgment, by state-owned enterprises and national champions, both of which will continue to receive very heavy government subsidies and policy distortions that give it a competitive advantage against American businesses and American workers, and really G7 plus businesses and G7 plus workers. So what do we do about that? Well, we inherited these tariffs, and while they may have created negotiating leverage, they serve no strategic purpose. And so our opportunity, and it's one of the tactical opportunities I was alluding to, is to reframe the purpose of these tariffs so that they're advancing real strategic priorities of the United States. That those could be critical supply chains. It could be maintaining our preeminence in foundational technologies, or it could be, we think carefully about products that have a genuine national security nexus. And for product categories that are not implicated by those objectives, there's really not much of a case for those tariffs being in place. Why do we have tariffs on bicycles or apparel or underwear? There are a whole host of goods, think of lists 3 or 4A, where it's not obvious to me at least what strategic purpose they're serving. And China too has retaliatory tariffs that are also lacking in any strategic purpose that I can discern. So that's the opportunity. It could be that in this moment of elevated inflation and China having its own very serious supply chain concerns above and beyond those caused by the war in Ukraine, but I'm referring to the zero COVID effects. Maybe there's something we can do there.
Well, this is really interesting because I looked at my experience working with China for decades. And what I saw when I was at the IMF, they don't want their currency to be the global reserve currency. They've seen what that means, like for the United States. I mean, we can't really control our exchange rate, and the Chinese very much want to be able to control it. And of course, they're far from being able to be a global reserve currency because of the capital controls, the limits on their economy, the directed monetary policies. I mean, far, far from it. But do you really think that China has that aspiration to be, if they're looking for global dominance, you would think they'd be looking for global economic dominance and make their currency the global reserve currency and feel that they were running the global economy. I just don't see them anywhere near able to do that, and not even in the foreseeable future. So anything you want to add to that, I'd appreciate. Thanks.
I suppose I agree with you. I think, so I agree in terms of their capacity, the capacity of China to engineer the renminbi's displacement of the dollar as the world's primary reserve currency. I see no chance of that happening anytime soon, particularly absent the kind of reforms that President Xi is unwilling to make. But as to their desire, it's not so much what I think, it's what they've said. They have expressed repeatedly a desire to reduce the dominance of the dollar in the global financial system. My view is, while we are in an increasingly multipolar world in terms of the distribution of global GDP, I don't think that shifts in global finance move in parallel with shifts in global economic output. And so, to me, dollar primacy shows very few signs of diminishing. Despite some of the self-imposed reputational damage we've caused in recent years. But if you look at the dollar's market share in terms of the use of a currency to save to borrow or to transact, it's still, very much on the order of 60%, 60%, 40%. And the next closest competitor is the euro, and the shares of the euro on those metrics is in the 20 to 25% for saving and borrowing, and around 35% for transacting. The renminbi is in the low single digits. And so the dollar, I think, still very much is the operating system of global finance. And I think there are very powerful network effects. The value of joining this network and the cost of being excluded from it, they've grown geometrically with time. And that gives us tremendous leverage, I believe, to absorb a shock, to generate a shock, a financial shock through sanctions, for example, to fund ourselves at highly advantageous rates, and to write global rules. So this is a privilege that we should treat this as a national asset. And like any other national asset, it will depreciate if you manage it poorly. And we can't take it for granted. I think we have to continue to invest in the conditions that gave us primacy in the first place. Strong and independent institutions like the Fed, rule of law, an open system for trade, for capital, for people. Also our story, people have to believe that the US is still a responsible global financial steward. We have to have a story that attracts ideas and talent and goodwill. The fact that people question whether that story is intact and whether those conditions are in place, that should be thought of as a problem, because I think of, every network has tipping points, and they're often psychological tipping points that are really difficult to identify in advance. And, we know from the history of networks, whether they're in biology or technology or finance or the seventh grade lunch table, in my case, they lose value really slowly and then very quickly, to use the phrase from Dornbush. And so the time to worry about these things is we should always be paranoid about losing dollar primacy, because when you see it in the data, when you see it in the measures I mentioned, it could be too late.
That is very reassuring. And I very happy to hear that you keep that in the forefront of your mind as you're considering all the different things that we are trying to achieve, both positively as well as what the impacts of the sanctions are. But we've gone on quite a while here. I really should turn it back to Emily to give people a chance some of our participants to ask questions. So Emily, back to you to manage the Q&A.
Thanks, Meg, and thanks very much, Daleep. Really a comprehensive look at the current situation. We do have a couple questions. Some of them have been addressed, but one question is on Iran. So Meg asked about kind of rolling back some of the tariffs on China. The question on Iran is, any thoughts on any sanctions unwind, even without a nuclear deal? Any thoughts on that, Daleep?
Yeah, I'm going to be, I need to be a little careful on what I say about Iran, but I think people know from reporting, we're waist deep in the negotiations. We're trying to strike a deal that has kind of a compliance for compliance flavor to it. There are still a few issues that are not resolved. If we get to a point at which we have a deal that puts Iran's nuclear program, as we say, back in the box, that it got out of once Trump left the JCPOA, then we'd do the deal, but we're not quite there yet.
Thank you. I appreciate the sensitivity around that. Another kind of topic, a question that's come in that we've been talking a lot about throughout our annual meeting this week is the real risk of fragmentation here. And you all have talked a little bit about kind of the decoupling, and Meg referenced Secretary Yellen's speech last week, linking, kind of trade policy to national security policy and the idea of friendshoring. So, can you say a little bit more about your views on how real you think the threat is of this decoupling and two kind of economic and political blocks?
Yeah, and Emily, you're referring generally speaking to supply chains, or do you mean broader economic decoupling? I can try to do both.
Yeah, both.
Okay, so on supply chains. I guess my way of thinking about it is we're at the point now, 2 years into supply chain disruptions, that we need to go beyond the abstract discussions of supply chain resilience, almost as like a throwaway talking point, and get into what that really means in practice. And especially in the context of a multiplayer repeated game that's playing out globally, every country is trying to boost what it calls supply chain resilience. But the first question that I think has to be asked is, what are you talking about when you say supply chain resilience? Resilience against what types of shocks? There are economic shocks, climate shocks, geopolitical shocks, health shocks, sometimes multiple shocks at once. And we should be clear that these shocks impose different kinds of stresses upon supply chains. So maybe that's obvious, but that's one. But then two is, how do you define resilience? Is it production capacity? Is it having a diversified set of suppliers and buyers? Is it the ability to absorb an exogenous shock? Is it the existence of trusted multilateral agreements? Should we think of these forms of resilience as economically equivalent or politically equivalent or geopolitically equivalent? And then third, the question I keep asking myself is it really resilience we're after? I think it depends on the supply chain you're talking about. Maybe resilience is appropriate for a supply chain like medical supplies. When we have no comparative advantage in producing those supplies, the margins are quite low. But maybe resilience isn't enough for a supply chain like semiconductors that have a national security nexus, especially leading edge semiconductors, and where you have, if you want to compete, you really need economies of scale, and you really can develop barriers to entry that become difficult for anyone to overcome if you're late. So then once we've defined what we mean by resilience and we understand what shocks we want resilience towards, and we are clear with ourselves about it, whether it's really resilience we're after, then we can have a real discussion about our tool set. What are the appropriate tools we should deploy on the supply side and the demand side? On the supply side, we have a lot of tools. It could be public investment in our R&D or our manufacturing capacity, or we can make changes to our immigration or education policy to boost our human talent in producing critical products. There could be incentives for the private sector through tax policy or regulation. And then we could have multilateral agreements that provide basically a form of insurance that allows us to surge capacity for a product when it's scarce at home, especially during a stressed episode. Then there are demand side tools like procurement or stockpiling that can create economies of scale. I'm saying all of this because we have to have a conversation with our allies and partners about how does the use of the tools I just mentioned, where would the use of our tools in a particular way, and if our allies copied us in the use of those tools, where would that leave us in equilibrium? Would that be a race to the bottom or a race to the top? So that's where we've got to go. And that's where we are, actually. That's the flavor of the conversation we're having. And Russia's invasion of Ukraine has put real urgency on finding answers to these questions in a way that brings us together and doesn't decouple in the way that your question suggested could occur. Now, undoubtedly, we're not going to have every country with us on talking about these questions. They're not going to see things the same way. But we want to the maximum extent possible, get as many countries, not just the G7, but much of the G20, in alignment about how to tackle these problems across semiconductors. I would say that the critical minerals for clean energy, pharmaceuticals, batteries, quantum, AI, and so forth.
Thanks, Daleep. I want to wrap up with one final question, kind of sticking with Secretary Yellen's speech and kind of what's core to the Bretton Woods Committee here are the IMF and World Bank. And she suggested the need for modernization of those two institutions in her speech. Do you have any thoughts on sort of what the specifics of that might look like?
Well, I mean, I'm in strong agreement. I think for the World Bank in particular, it's really past time to reimagine and reboot the mission and the business model of the World Bank because of everything we've been talking about. The dominant risks in the world are increasingly global: climate, pandemics, migration, financial stability, and they don't respect borders. But the bank's business model, and I've never worked at the World Bank, and so I say this with humility. Others may think I sound crazy, but the bank's business model to me is not especially suited to produce and catalyze global public goods. And especially for crises that require financing for regional initiatives like, or non-sovereign entities like COVAX. And I think at a time when the global recovery is historically uneven, and major shareholders are running out of fiscal space, we really need the IFIs and the World Bank in particular to embrace and deploy their countercyclical firepower. And the AAA rating, I think the bank has made a fetish out of its AAA rating over the course of many years. And for my part, I don't see why a AAA rating is core to the bank's business model. One notch lower, just like we were downgraded one notch. Maybe that has an impact of 10 to 15 basis points on the bank's borrowing costs. But I've seen studies that show a one notch lower downgrade could boost the bank's lending capacity by 3x, maybe more. And it could also allow the bank, if it's willing to have more risk appetite, it could act more and more as a first mover in terms of its investments in the developing world. It could take on first loss positions that could potentially motivate a step change in the private sector's willingness to co-invest and to truly get leverage in terms of climate finance or health security financing in the trillions of dollars, because that's what's going to be needed to hit the Paris goals when it comes to climate, both on emissions reduction and adaptation. So we need a private sector multiplier of 4 to 5x, not less than 1x, which I think is where we are now. The last point I would make about the bank and really the IFIs in general is we need their voice to get a lot louder about the need for debt restructuring in the developing world. We have, 60%, Meg could correct me, 60% of low-income countries are already in debt distress or at high risk, given what's happening to interest rates and the strength of the dollar. So we're going to need China in particular, but also the private sector to step up and take burden sharing seriously through the common framework. So there's a lot more to say about that, but I'm just in full-throated agreement with the Secretary on this.
Well, Daleep, thank you. And thank you for bringing up debt. This is something that Meg knows the Bretton Woods Committee is working on, and we're in full agreement with you that the IFIs need to lead in this space. Meg, final comments before we wrap up?
Yeah, no, just really pleased to see the focus on bringing the private sector into that finance and using the institutions to help mobilize that, because we've got so many problems that need to be dealt with that we see every day. And I think it's time that we make that effort to get those countries that kind of help. So thank you very much. It's been great having you here. Really insightful comments. And I think it's been very helpful for all the Bretton Woods Committee membership to hear what you have to say today. So thank you.
Thank you, Meg. Thanks everybody for joining and for inviting me.
Daleep. Thanks for being so open and forthright. Thanks everyone for joining, and we will see you tomorrow, hopefully in person. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.